Russell Norman. Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, does he stand by his statement in relation to drought-stricken farmers that, and I quote, "I wasn't referring to climate change, it's just that if it turned out that there was a succession of droughts, there's no amount of government assistance that can offset that effect on farming"?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, yes. While the Greens think they own climate change, in fact, climate has been fluctuating forever, including in the last 40 or 50 years, and farmers have several times had to change their farming practices according to longer periods of drier or wetter summers. And that's the point I was making. The government assistance for the droughts is in no way intended to take pressure off farmers to adapt their farming practice if that's what is required by weather patterns.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he agree with the government's own research body, the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, when it states, and I quote, "Droughts are projected to become more frequent and more intense under climate change"?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't want to question the scientific effort that's gone into that. Although there is always uncertainty about these predictions. I recall similar predictions made by similar scientific bodies in Australia just 4 or 5 years ago, and it hasn't stopped raining since.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he accept that human-induced climate change is real?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it may well be, but I'm not sure what that's got to do with this particular question. The fact is that the government is assisting farmers with short-term emergency-type assistance through a drought. If there are a succession of droughts, farmers will need to change their farming practice. Government assistance will not protect them from the consequences of it.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Does he understand that what it has to do with this question is that if climate change is happening and it's human-caused, that we will face more droughts and more intense droughts?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that could turn out to be the case. The point I'm making is that fluctuating climate is not new to farmers. It might be a recent discovery by the Greens as a way of making political points, but farmers in New Zealand have for a few hundred years actually been adapting their farming practice according to relatively short cycles of weather change. In the 70s there was a run of droughts. Later on in the 80s there was a run of quite wet summers and farming practice changed significantly. It may have to change again.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
If New Zealand is facing more droughts and more intense droughts because of climate change, why is his government doing nothing to reduce New Zealand's greenhouse emissions? And at an international level, why is it undermining international efforts to cut greenhouse emissions?
Honourable Bill
English. The member is simply wrong. I could run through the whole range of initiatives, including the government continuing to implement the emissions trading system, which the Greens were part of creating. The result, of course, is quite striking that when the Greens were supporting a Labor government, emissions were going up rapidly. Since that government went out, emissions have flattened or dropped.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why has the government undermined international efforts to take action on climate change by refusing to make commitments under the Kyoto 2 Protocol?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we just don't agree with the member's interpretation of that. I have to say, though, that the New Zealand government is happy to be judged by what it does. Climate change is a policy area where there's an awful lot of rhetoric, including coming from countries who haven't taken anything like the decisive actions that the New Zealand government has taken. But we're happy to be judged by what we have done. There's quite a long list of it.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Is he aware that New Zealand government is being judged internationally, and as a result of the decision of his government to not make binding commitments in the second Kyoto period, that New Zealand has been condemned internationally for undermining efforts to address climate change that cause more drought and more intense drought?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I don't know what the member's referring to, but I have to say sometimes I'm a bit taken aback by the willingness of the Green Party and its global cohorts, particularly the New Zealand Green Party, to condemn New Zealand government policy from the safety of offshore conferences where everyone thinks that they agree the same things about climate change. The fact is that being condemned internationally by a handful of NGOs is not going to influence New Zealand government policy.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
How is it consistent for the Minister to say he cares about drought and the impact of drought on farmers and on New Zealand on the one hand, and on the other hand, in terms of climate change policy, this government has watered down the emissions trading scheme very significantly, and in terms of international negotiations has made it much harder for international cooperation by refusing to make commitments under Kyoto?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, we think it's quite consistent to make the statements that I have about our concern about drought and to continue to advance New Zealand's contribution to reducing emissions. And I might say, in terms of if the measurement is actual reduction in emissions, then New Zealand is in a much better state 5 years on from the change of government than we might have imagined even just 3 or 4 years ago. If the measurement is rhetoric about climate change, then I accept the member's criticism. We don't go on about it and don't boast and don't try and inflate what we're doing.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
If climate change is having an effect on the New Zealand climate and producing more droughts and more intense droughts, and the only way to really resolve it is through global action, surely the government should be leading in global action to address climate change instead of being dragged behind, which would mean that New Zealand farmers would benefit from the actions of his government instead of suffering as a result of them.
Honourable Bill English, and so there's a question there.
Well, Mr Speaker, while I think if the member compares the actions of the New Zealand government over the last 6 or 8 years, actually, with almost any other government in the developed world, I think you'd find us near the top of the list for sensible climate change policy, and near the top of the list for the change in emissions, which ultimately is the measure of whether we're getting anywhere.
Order.
Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table a NIWA report on climate change scenarios for brands, study of the built environment.
A NIWA report's available to members readily? Then it will not be put. Question number 6, Simon O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Minister for Tertiary Education, Skills and Employment.